Prize for the promise. And personally, I've always been a big admirer of his writings, and I was delighted when he netted the award on that year. And he was the first person in November 2021, right at the end. He said, "Well, everything's set, but there's this new virus which is in the air, and that was the Omicron." And we know what it did for that short period of December and January in India. So the plans to bring him then fell through. Then he was exhausted in January 2022. And that was 22, 23 was exhausted. And now he's here fully refreshed after some good R&R in Goa. So a round of applause for Damon. Thank you so much for keeping your promise.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
So this session is called Galgutnama, and Damon asked me what is the meaning of Galgutnama. So I explained that it's the life and times of an Indianism for the memoirs of somebody. And the three books we are dealing with today. The first one was written in 2003. The second one a little less than a decade thereafter, and then we have The Promise. And if you put the three novels together, it's not as though Damon didn't write other books, but these were the three that were shortlisted for the Booker, and of course, one did win it. They speak of different points in the trajectory of the reconciliation and the history of South Africa in the new millennium. So at present, we are almost 25 years into the 21st century, and perhaps it's a good time to look back at these three novels as one particular set. So, 20 years from The Good Doctor, how does it feel?
Like 20 years often feels a very short time and also quite a long one, depending on what you're focusing on. But my writing life started a lot further back, at a kind of perversely young age. It's the thing I've always wanted to do. It's the thing I'd be doing regardless of whether the Booker had, come my way or not. And at this point in my life, it's the only thing I'm vaguely qualified to do. So, yeah, it's an ongoing journey. Maybe we'll be having another conversation in a couple of decades from now.
Okay, so The Good Doctor, let's start with that. It's got these two characters who are diametrically opposite to each other from the point of view of a reader. One is jaded and very dissatisfied and just in a rut, and the other one, Lawrence Waters, comes with this entire enthusiasm and the desire to make a difference. So whenever I read reviews of the book, they're seen as two sides of the coin that was South Africa in the early years the of the century. So how did you create this polarity, and how was the novel received there in South Africa?
Um, the period after 1994, which was our first democratic elections in South Africa, from a literary point of view, was sort of uncharted territory. If you go back earlier than that, it was very clear to speak in very broad terms, who the bad guys were, who the good guys were. Um, and a certain kind of literature develops out of clear morality like that. So I would think of a writer like Nadine Gordimer as having dominated that period. I mean, she was not alone, of course. There was, a whole swathe of writers who were facing up to apartheid one way or the other. But that was not my generation. My generation sort of came to adulthood in the time that the ANC came to power. Nelson Mandela was released from prison. Various political parties were unbanned. All things that had been unthinkable in my childhood. But the public morality that accompanied these changes was a lot more ambiguous and murky than the morality of the apartheid time. So, in a certain sense, writers had to rethink how do we deal with this current period. There was a great deal of idealism and optimism in the air, certainly in the 1990s. So I thought, well, let me try and face up to that optimism. But I'm a cynical person at heart. Um, Well, I don't think of myself as cynical. I think of myself as realistic, but very often cynicism and realism seem to overlap, especially in South Africa. So I wanted to oppose the kind of naive optimism of a character like Lawrence Waters with somebody more jaded, as you put it, somebody of my ilk and age. And Frank, who is the narrator of the book, is, the embodiment of that voice. He's not me exactly, but he's a version of me. And what was interesting for me was to set these two visions against each other, as I think you put it, as a kind of polarity. So yeah, the book came out of a swirling around of those sorts of forces. It was not fashionable back then, incidentally, to be too cynical about the new South Africa. I'm sorry to say that I think Frank's notions about the country have proved to be far closer to the truth than the idealistic ones of Lawrence Waters.
I was going to ask, so do you think Frank's vision is what finally prevailed? And you mentioned that there was this period of murkiness, which is what your generation of writers were trying, because there's always this accusation that before your generation came along, there was a tendency to place white guilt above black suffering in the writing, and that gave birth to a kind of particular trajectory in all the stories that were coming out of South Africa. So as a young author, were you troubled by this, and is a lot of your writing in some ways a reaction to correcting that?
Well, you can't live in a society that's organized around these perverse principles. I'm talking about apartheid time without being drawn into it in some other way. Either your own opinions and values shift to support that, or they shift to oppose it. I suppose. I mean, my family is by no means radical. They were not rabid racists, but they were fairly comfortable with the setup. And it would have been easy, I suppose, just to continue that family tradition. Um, but from an early age, I guess I was questioning those things. I don't mean to claim that as some kind of moral mantle, because I was part of the system. I did 2 years in the apartheid military, sitting in an office doing very little, but still I was part of that machine. So yes, we all white South Africans of that age, I think to whatever degree carry guilt for our participation, whether we know it or not. But yes, a lot of white South Africans have actively been trying to shed their guilt or to demonstrate that they were opposed to these things. That in itself stirs cynicism in me because our lives were comfortable. My life is still comfortable, for that matter. Um, Sorry, I could go on this topic for a long time, but the short answer is yes. I guess a lot of white South African writing is rooted in a sense of guilt and a wish to atone. That's maybe given way in more recent years to the desire to understand where we are now, because part of the moral shift that I've been talking about is the heroes of yesteryear, the ANC, political figures that were delivering, justice and truth to the country, are now not so heroic. A great many of them have been involved in, corruption. A great many of them still are. So, once you lose your heroes, um, it's very hard to know who to look up to, who to follow, and it's also much harder to know who the villains are. We all seem to be a little closer to, the villainous side of things at the moment. Um, but yeah, the South African journey has been a sad one in lots of ways. It's not over yet, of course, and a lot of things could still take place. But in some small way, as a novelist, I guess I think it's my duty not to point the way to the future, but maybe to disturb and shake up people as to where we are now. I see the function of books as to disturb, to upset, and question. Somebody told me that the roots of the word interesting come from the Latin inter esse, in other words, to be between two things. There's nowhere more interesting, I think, than the horns of a dilemma. And in some way, I'm trying in a small way with my own writing to to place readers on the horns of a dilemma, not to solve that dilemma, but to make them perhaps feel it more acutely.
In this journey across these three books, the other, but before I reach the second one, In a Strange Room, is memory. So that is an important part of The Good Doctor as well, where he has this memory of his time in the military and his guilt for something, for an incident that happened. I don't want to let out too much, and how he deals with it, and a similar sense of grappling with memory, and albeit on a personal level, is what informs In a Strange Room, which, if someone put a gun to my head, is my favorite of the three. And again, it's how unreliable memory can be, how you're a spectator to it as well as somebody with agency in it. So how much does the this recurring theme of memories and how protagonist works with it, how does that inform your writing and what you're trying to say about these dilemmas that you place before the reader?
Well, I guess it's very central. I mean, it's very central to my own being in a way. I have this theory that all consciousness, all human consciousness, is memory. Even the present moment is, in fact, a memory of something that's happened a split second ago, and that we kind of construct a narrative out of memory and give emphasis to particular moments in order to construct the story of our lives as we go along. And you can do that in a big way, or you can do it in a small, much more granular way, the story of your day or the story of the past hour. But these are stories we're constructing. And we construct them around what we remember, because a lot of the day disappears instantly, more and more as I get older, sorry to say. But memory, yes, is very, very central to all human life. I don't think it's just me or South Africa that grapples with memory. But now that I've mentioned South Africa, I also think there's such a thing as national memory. And that comes very much into question in a country like mine, where you're fed one particular version of reality because, the white nationalist government was very keen that a particular narrative be imposed. And then you have a major change of government, and suddenly those memories are all, under question and have to be reconstructed because there were lots of people whose lives and memories were suppressed at that time. So there was a great flowering, if you like, after the end of apartheid, of writing, of memoir and autobiography, people reclaiming, in a certain sense, their life stories which had been buried or pushed out of sight. So yeah, memory is a very central feature for me. It continues to be.
The other central feature is all your novels have extensive descriptions of the landscape and how the protagonist is negotiating and how it reflects where he goes, his travels, the way he negotiates this landscape is also very reflective of who he is. And this is also there in Kurdzi's books to some extent. This whole the bleakness is in some ways reflected in the landscape that he describes. So in in a strange room, those journeys that you've described, you yourself are an inveterate traveler. So how much of your own travels did you use to mirror this protagonist? And you said that the cynicism of Frank is a bit of you. So how much of the he and the I in a strange room is Damon?
All of it, actually. The the platform, the premise of the book is I took three quite extreme journeys that I'd made in my life. Each of them was made in the company of another person. And really, my task was to try to document as fully as possible, to remember as fully as possible what happened on those journeys and how my relationship with my traveling companion changed in that time. It's in certain ways quite a simple project. The complexity of it is in the construction, I guess. Um, there was a question, because those pieces were first published separately in the Paris Review, and there was a question at time of publication: do we publish this as fiction, as non-fiction, as a travelogue, as memoir? And in a funny way, it's all of those things and none. So the decision was taken that we would publish them as fiction, and then that carried through into the publication of the book when those three pieces were put together. But there was a reaction against that. This is not fiction. This is Damon talking about himself, and that's true. But if you go back to what I've just said, that all memory is a fictional construction, a story that we're telling ourselves, the label of fiction seemed fair to me. I will pick up on something else there, that the narrative switches between the first person and the third person. It goes sometimes inside the same sentence between he does that and I remember this or I felt that. Um, it's a sort of jump that might be absolutely disorientating, but a lot of people understood it instinctively in the same way that I felt it, if you like, when I wrote it. Because memory is, in fact, that process. If you remember your own life, you're likely at certain moments to see it from the outside, watch yourself as a character in a drama doing certain things. And that's your life in the third person. And at other moments, it's almost, in a Proustian way, as if you're back in that moment, reliving it and there, and you're very much an I. So that switch, although it might seem illogical in a certain way, in a much more visceral way, is something I think most of us understand in ourselves, if not with our brains.
So it's promised as a reading. Would you like to do it now, or would you want me to ask you since we are at in a strange room?
I'm happy to do the reading, and incidentally, I'm very glad that you singled this out as the book of mine you like the most, because I think it is my own favorite amongst my offspring. Maybe only because it's so very, very personal, and most novels are personal only in an impersonal way, if I can put it like that. I'll take a very short reading from a fairly crucial central section of the book. I won't set it up because it's not that sort of book. I hope that some of it will come through. He doesn't feel like a traveler anymore. It's hard to imagine that he ever thought of himself that way. And when he finally settles himself to write a letter to Jerome, it's like a stranger willing up the words. He tells about where he is and what it's like to be here, and says that he hopes Jerome will come to visit him one day. A week after he sends the letter, an envelope arrives from Switzerland. He doesn't recognize the handwriting, but the stamp is clearly visible, and it's with a sense of excitement that he sits down to read. When he opens the envelope, his own letter falls out, like a piece of the past returned to his hands. The single stiff card that accompanies it says, "Dear Sir, I'm very sorry to break the death of Jerome to you. He died on the 26th of November in an accident of motorbike. His mother asked me to send you your letter back." The signature at the bottom is that of a stranger, and even as he sits at the epicenter of this soundless white explosion, that separate, watchful part of his brain is back again, reading over his shoulder, trying to decipher the name, aware of all the oddities of language, working out when it happened. 1 week to the day after I got back home. A journey is a gesture inscribed in space. It vanishes even as it's made. You go from one place to another place and on to somewhere else again, and already behind you there's no trace that you were ever there. The roads you went down yesterday are full of different people now. None of them knows who you are. In the room you slept in last night, a stranger lies in the bed. Dust covers over your footprints. The marks of your fingers are wiped off the door. From the floor and table, the bits and pieces of evidence that you might have dropped are swept up and thrown away, and they never come back again. The very air closes behind you like water, and soon your presence, which felt so weighty and permanent, has completely gone. Things happen once only and are never repeated, never return, except in memory. He sits for a long time at the table, not seeing, not hearing anything. When he feels strong enough to move, he gets up very slowly and locks the house and goes out, walking into the world. His body feels old, and through the dark lens on his eyes, everything he knows looks strange and unfamiliar, as if he's lost in a country he's never visited before. So I'll leave it there.
That is truly beautiful. The other recurring thing I would like to, all your books have these travelers who are moving and who are from different countries in the case of In a Strange Room. And yet they all seem to belong to one nation of the unmoored. So this metaphor of traveling, you have Anton also in The Promise, keeps moving. You have Amor. So, what is this? Like I said, memory is a recurring theme in your books. So is movement, moving from one place, gathering. In our first literary meet, Vikram Seth used this line, gathering life. So that your books remind me of that. These are protagonists who are gathering life through travel, and then their memories, however unreliable they are. This question is becoming very long. So, what is travel? What is travel for you as a metaphor?
Um, it is a metaphor, but it's also a condition, if you like. Much less so in my case now. But in my earlier years, I was almost existentially restless. I really was not able to stay in one place for more than a couple of months at a time. So as a traveler, I'm not a happy traveler. There are people who are traveling towards a place because they want to be there. In a certain sense, I think I was always traveling away from places because I couldn't be there any longer. There was often not a very clear destination in mind. And as I say, this was a kind of a condition, an inability to sit still. Um, there's some or other writer, I can't remember who made the observation that all of the trouble in the world comes from the fact that people are unable to sit in a room quietly. And I guess I was for a very long time afflicted by that kind of trouble, internal troubled state. Um, but metaphorically, that has resonance because life in itself is a kind of a restless journey. One is hardly ever the same person from day to day. You're always moving towards some undefined destination. You may define a destination for yourself, but very often you end up, in another place altogether. And really, it's what you encounter along the way that makes your life. A bit like the Cavafy poem Ithaca, where the journey is towards Ithaca, but in fact, the substance of the journey is what happens on the way. And I see that as a very I don't know, a full, pregnant metaphor, if you like, for what it is to be human for the brief time that we are on the earth.
So that brings me to The Promise, which is the book that you've been speaking about for 2 years now. So we've just made one third of this session. This covers a larger period, and quite wickedly, by the second part of the book, you know what the author is trying to do, and the name of the book, the name of that part gives away what's happening. So you start with the reconciliation, and the first part of it. There's a funeral in the middle of the Rugby World Cup, which we in India remember, those of us who like our sport, as a moment which later became a film. This moment of triumph for South Africa. It's the final metaphor of reconciliation, and then the way you've portrayed it as something where it's happening at the back. It's the official version of South Africa, but what's happening at the foreground in the funeral is quite different. So you cover a period of 2.5 decades. And what made you take this whole journey with this family? And the promise itself becomes so ironic because it's about a country's promise, which has in many ways been broken.
Yes, in fact, the span of the book is more like 40 years than 2.5 decades. And it's really the period of my adult life, the period of my life, I guess, where my mind and political consciousness have been as full as they're ever likely to get. Um, but it was not that first attracted me to this book. It was really a personal anecdote from a friend who was telling me about his four family funerals. He's the last surviving member of his family, and he happens to be a very funny guy, and he tells stories in a very funny way. So although the subject matter was bleak, he made it very, very funny. He was telling me, about his father's funeral, his mother's funeral, and I realized the same cast of characters was coming up at these funerals and behaving in the same sort of way. And of course, various issues were carried one decade to the next. And I thought, well, I've read a lot of family sagas, but I've never really read one that's structured around funerals. But once I started to think about that, I thought, well, I'm very obsessed increasingly with the passage of time, um, looking back on my own life, much more of it behind me than in front of me, probably. Um, and I thought, well, I'm humanly equipped to deal with a trajectory like this. And then I thought, well, I can talk about lives that I know, people growing up and living in Pretoria, which is where I grew up, and this national journey from oppression to reconciliation to disappointment to wherever it is we are now, beyond disappointment, but certainly not on an upward curve. Um, all of it, fitting into time, and time is the medium which changes everything, changes each individual human life, each human face, but also the life and face of a country. And South Africa's journey over the last 40 years has been a very, very dramatic one, much more dramatic than, for a lot of other countries. So all of it, from a novelistic point of view, felt like very rich material. And I set about doing it, but it would be fake if I said to you, well, I got this idea, as a package, and I decided it was a book that accumulated. Most novels do. You get one idea, and a second possibility sort of fastens on it like a barnacle, and then a third one comes along, and basically the possibilities of your novelistic scope open up. But it's like a photograph developing. It takes place again, like the book itself, over a period of time.
Okay, the character of Anton is a fascinating one for me because, like Frank, he too carries this one terrible memory that he can't shake off and makes him, in many ways, the adult he becomes. So, do these memories of that period, which your generation went through, of do many South Africans write about their time in the army?
Surprisingly few, actually. It's always been a little bit of a mystery to me because it was called national service, but it was enforced conscription into the apartheid military. In other words, it was only young white men who were being drafted, and very often in a fight against fellow South Africans, black South Africans, putting down dissent and resistance. I was fortunate enough not to be in that position, but lots of my friends were, people I was at school with, killed in their military time, being shot at, and also, as happens to Anton, killing other people. Not a fate they ever could have imagined for themselves, and something, as I'm sure you would understand, you are likely to carry for the rest of your life. Um, but if you think about America's Vietnam experience, how that has been endlessly unpacked through novels and films, and if you think of culture as a way for a nation to understand itself, it makes sense that that process would take place. South Africa, I mean, there are some films, some books and pieces of writing, but for me, mostly it's a kind of a dirty, buried secret. It's not really secret, but it's unprocessed. And part of the reason that I think South Africa is a very, very, well, let me put it in an extreme term. We're a sick society, and that sickness comes from unprocessed memory, stuff that has not been dealt with. um, the process of psychotherapy, I think, is putting into language what your internal conflicts are. Once it's externalized in the form of language, it becomes something you can work with. But until then, many people cannot even express what it is that troubles them. And I think in many ways that affliction is what South Africa carries. It's all sort of buried, and the big project of reconciliation in South Africa, while it was necessary and felt very good at the time, in some ways was a lid that kept everything out of sight and undiscussed. So yeah, I have friends from back then who sometimes come and in a inebriated state will talk about their experiences on the border or things that happened to them, things they did. These are the needs of people to get their demons out. Those demons are very much part of South African life, unfortunately. And again, with the amoral eye of a novelist, it's rich material from a much more involved and implicated point of view. As a South African, that is pain. Pain and difficulty that needs a solution and isn't likely to find one.
Finally, before I throw it open, the other theme which I found very brave in the promise is you're unflinching in your depiction of there's no valorizing or unnecessary romanticizing of colored folk as well. So you have Luke, you have the Astrid's death. So these are all parts of South Africa. I have visited South Africa. There is a sense of danger and crime in some areas. So you've been very unflinching in, not just showing the white characters as flawed, but also showing that there are flaws in other parts of the country.
Well, one reaction to the book, very, very strong reaction, much stronger than I anticipated, in fact, from a lot of commentators in the UK in particular, was that I had not given a full voice or expression to the black characters. But that was a deliberate decision on my part. Um, not out of a kind of a woke fear of speaking for people whose lives I'm not qualified to speak for, but because I think for a lot of white South Africans, black South Africans almost don't exist, except in terms of the functions they perform, which are usually to help a white household live its life. So I wanted that sort of myopia, that kind of moral blank spot, if you like, in the white South African psyche, to be a problem at the center of the book. I mean, in many ways, the central character in the book is this black woman, Salome, to whom this piece of land has been promised. Um, Yet we never really get a full sense of what Salome's inner life is like in the way that, I give an inner life to the white characters. I thought about, finding a moment in the book where I might open the gate and let that life out to the reader's view. But I decided against it because I thought it was much more important to leave the reader with this frustrating sense that this story is not complete, that there is this blank spot. What do we do about that? Again, to come back to an earlier point in our discussion, I see it as the function of literature to disturb people, and that for me is the most disturbing thing about the promise, that the white characters do not see this person, do not fully perceive her inner life.
Not
That
even a more.
Well, to a larger degree, but I think a more is the one member of this family who has a moral impulse, but her moral impulse is also very much open to question, and that again is deliberate. I dislike heroics, you know, heroic men and heroic women doing the right thing. Again, I don't see it as the function of literature to point the way forward. The days of Tolstoy are over. I see it as much more the writer's function to churn things up and make people see things afresh, things you might take for granted, things you might assume are fine. But to leave people troubled by something with a sense that there's a problem that needs to be solved, that seems to me much more useful, because people will carry that around with them, and maybe in their minds or in their own lives, they might find a solution to that problem.
So where is the churning happening? Where are you writing these days? You mentioned you wrote in a strange room in Goa. So where is your work desk now?
Um, well, one particular fallout of the Booker Prize is that your normal life is removed from you, and you get given this other highly unnatural and nomadic existence. So I haven't done much writing of the sort that I'm supposed to be doing in the last couple of years. I've got back to it a little bit now, but I'm working on a collection of short stories, and it's about people who are far away from home. Each story has that as a premise. Um, that seems to be, building on our earlier conversation too. I have this theory that people who are away from home behave differently to how they do when they're at home. It's partly because the reference points are not there. It's also partly because you're not being observed by the people who might be keeping tabs on you at home. So people's behavior changes, not always for the better. But again, it makes for more interesting subject matter if people behave badly.
So, looking forward to a novel full of ill behaved travelers. And we are very happy to launch it at this festival if whenever it comes out. I think that's a great point for us to throw this open. I have seen a hand even before I could complete the sentence. We'll start with the gentleman in yellow here and then go. The next question is the gentleman in red.
Hello. Thank you so much. Very good afternoon, sir. And firstly, I would like to thank KLM for like arranging this session. Like watching you accepting the Booker Prize on stage, and now you're talking in front of me. It means a lot. Like I would suggest it's for many of us, it's a dream come true moment. So my question is a bit long. I apologize for that. So I would like to say, sir, like. Uh, Provided the restlessness we see everywhere, including my own country, I find myself fortunate enough. I am reading about South Africa, I'm reading about Ethiopia, or whatever country it is. And as a reader, I feel like whenever someone is asking me a suggestion about any point of his indecision or her indecision, so my point should be very clear, and that kind of clarity I derive from the novels. So you already mentioned you like to omit the heroic part, and you like to put us in a like restlessness, which I honestly admire, because we get the opportunity to think. So but recently, sir, in the literary world, a lot of violence has been like we have seen a lot of violence. So, and after a book get published, it gets banned also, so that many people cannot read it. So I would like to ask you, sir, about the other end. Like, after you finish writing a book, it goes through a process like editorials and a lot of things. So if you have ever felt anything to be omitted because of that pressure, or we are fortunate enough to read the raw story about the part of the world you are speaking to us, sir.
Self-censor.
Um, Thank you. I I personally have never come under pressure to cut anything or alter anything unless it's from editorial considerations, not from political considerations. So every book does go through an editorial process. You to whatever degree open to that. There's some writers who think their words are sacred and they should not be changed. I personally find the editorial process quite healthy. You're being challenged or questioned. Um, and it's a process you put yourself through too as well. Before you ever submit it to a publisher, you have to go through every line of your book and think, does that ring true? Is it true? Can I defend this line? So hopefully by the end of that process, even if something you've written is controversial or upsetting to people, you would be able to stand on a platform like this and say, I know why I did it. These are my reasons. You don't have to agree, but these are my reasons. So I'm lucky in that sense because, white South Africa, when I grew up, was subject to censorship. Writers were routinely banned, subject to house arrest, sometimes to deportation. Um, that's not the case any longer. I'm very, very opposed to that sort of interference and censorship. It's, to me, the sign of great trouble in a society when people cannot speak and express their thoughts freely. Your thoughts may be upsetting to people, um, but people, you know, unless it's hate speech that's calling on people to harm other people, I think any thought should be up for grabs. And I'm continually surprised by people who get upset by novels in the way that they would be upset by real human events. Because, in a certain way, I think novels are test tubes. that they're not real life, and therefore you can test out ideas. You can have characters say things that really in real life you may not be able to say without fear of harm. But in a novel, where's the harm? Yet people are very, very, very threatened by ideas. So yeah. Sorry, it's a general reply, but the short answer is that I myself have never been subject to that sort of censorship or self censorship, and I hope it never comes my way.
There's a question at the back there.
This might sound a bit cliched, but it's kind of related to the previous answer that you have given. So when your novels are predominantly replete with autobiographical elements. So when you choose the novel form, uh, what are the factors that drive you to write a novel rather than writing an autobiography?
Um, it's not altogether true that all my books are, rooted in autobiography. It's definitely true for a couple of titles, but I also think it's true for all novelists that they're drawing on their own lives in some shape or form. It might be refracted, into an entirely new character, different gender, different situation. But if you're not in some way working something out for yourself, what is the point? I mean, there are books and writers whose only aim is to entertain other people. In other words, to create a plot-based diversion. That kind of book is fine. I can read that with enjoyment too. But those are not the books that really matter to me. The ones that really matter are those where, as I say, people are working something out for themselves. Um, but you don't have to do that in a directly autobiographical way. In fact, I mean, I like to spend some time letting the biographical stuff transform, if you like, into some other, for want of a better way of putting it, dreamlike form, in the way that your dreams might be a process of working out your day. There are people you don't know but who seem familiar, scenarios that likewise might seem half familiar to you. A novel is something like a dream process, a much more structured process than an actual dream, but a refraction of your own life, if you like.
There's a lady on this side. Yeah. We'll just take two more questions.
Good evening. You keep mentioning about restlessness and how authors are restless, and even you not being able to sit at a point. What I want to know is every time you write a book or you write a story, does that help you deal with your restlessness or does it make you more restless?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that all writers are restless, by the way. I was talking about myself, really. I know some writers who barely ever leave home. Um, you know, in order to write a book, you need a certain amount of stability in your life. You need a routine. You need a place you go to every day. So I suppose once you're committed to the process of writing, it's in your interest to try to stay in one place if you can. I haven't always got that right, and I've done quite a bit of writing in India, in a place I don't really belong, and in other places too. But yeah, I think, and incidentally, as I get older, I become more sedentary. I'm now a homeowner, and I do feel a sense of belonging in a tiny little patch of the world. So that restless condition has eased somewhat. But yeah, writing's probably a good way to force yourself to stay stiller than you might otherwise be.
Okay, we have time for one more question. So, short and sweet one. There's a lady here. Questions, Mercy.
Good,
It's working. It's
good
working.
evening. I would just like to say I've lived in South Africa for a couple of years, from around 2003 to 2007. And I just want to say that it is one of the most beautiful countries I've ever visited. I've been to other parts of the world, And we were living in Cape Town, and the landscape is so beautiful, and the people are also beautiful. But I, as an Indian, was an outsider. So I had black friends and I had white friends. And it was a very interesting place where I realized that South Africa faces something very similar to India. We have a very fractured past. And South Africa also has a fractured past. And it's all about coming to terms with it. And your books, I think, help us a lot. That way, like, we sort of, I find it very metaphorical. So I just wanted to say that. And I like it, like seeing you from South Africa. It reminds me of all the beautiful days I had over there. There's no question over there. I just like to congratulate you on the very beautiful country you come from. The landscape is wonderful, beautiful.
Thank you. I wish I could take credit for the landscape, but I didn't make it.
I used to say right bang opposite Table Mountain.
Oh, well,
Okay, and I think everybody should go and visit South Africa. I'm not from South Africa tourism, by the way, but it is a place worth visiting. Thank you.
it is a very, very extraordinary landscape with a very painful history that plays out against it. And that discrepancy, I think, um, relates to something you raised earlier. I mean, the incredible beauty of the landscape makes it a presence in most stories, but it's that very landscape that's under contention in South Africa. Who owns it? Who was there first? Who belongs? Who doesn't belong? These are all the questions we fight over, and yet that landscape remains a constant that all of us in some way feel we belong to and love and can never quite possess.
Thank you. I think that's a beautiful note to end the session on. As she mentioned, perhaps a lot of the stories you write also resonate with us in India because we have similar fractured pasts and similar things to negotiate about our own memory. And perhaps that's what makes for good fiction. And may you continue writing these wonderful books. And thank you so much, Damon, for a rather arduous journey over 3 books in about 50 minutes.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank all of you for those lovely questions.
Damon will be signing books at the bookstore.